Welcome, guys, to episode 3 of the Waxcast podcast. I am your host, Gavin Wax, and we are high energy today, recording 3 episodes back to back. Today, or rather this third episode today, I am happy to be joined by my good friend, Gabriel Montalvo, who is the Northeast Regional Director for the Republican National Hispanic Assembly and the activism chair of the New York Young Republic. He's a good friend of mine. Gabriel, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for being here. They say that, third is best somehow. I don't know. I'm trying to make it feel a bit more relevant. But I'm honored to be here.
Third time's a charm. Third time's a charm. That's what you're looking for. You just had a total brain fart. It's okay, but that's how we like to start off shows. But wanted to bring you on. We just had a kind of a philosophical podcast before, talking about libertarianism, that kind of stuff. I want to just talk like meat and potatoes politics with you right now, because you're a political guy. You do a lot of stuff with campaigns. You do a lot of stuff with different political organizations. I want to talk about Trump and his performance in this 2020 election, which I still think has not been fully decided yet, and we will wait and see. We could talk about that too as well. But to open, a lot of people have discussed Trump. He's a racist, and he needs to broaden the community and the Republican Party. It seems that Trump, especially 2016 Trump, basically came out of the gate. He said, "This is who I am. These are my views. I'm a populist. I have these views on the border. I have these views on immigration. I have these views on law and order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And everyone said, those views are going to lose you votes. You're going to decrease your share with, Hispanics, with blacks, with whoever. But in reality, it turns out that his approach, which was not pandering, which was just saying, here are my views, these are views that anyone can accept, actually worked for him. And he's increased his share of various different minority communities in terms of their votes. And the pandering strategy of the old GOP seems to have failed. And, Democrats playing Despacito and all this other crap also seems to have, not worked as well this cycle. Obviously, they still won majorities, but we chipped away at those majorities and we won some points on the margin, which counts a lot in electoral math. So do you agree with this assessment that the pandering is BS? And if you just go full speed with populism and just an honest message, you'll win over more hearts and minds?
I mean, 100%. I think there is something that the Democrats did do very well, though, and that has to be AOC's marketing campaign for Goya. I think she did a great job. She is saleswoman, or Woman X of the month. And it's by another fellow Latinx person.
Latinx.
Right.
Do not misgender them.
Yeah, I would never dream of it. It's not like that got me into problems before. But honestly, I think back when the whole escalator moment when Trump was coming down and he said, the famous quote, "Mexicans saying their people, they're not saying their best." That is probably the biggest thing that a lot of people question why a Hispanic would support the president is when he said that quote. And at first, it turned me off, and I have this wonderful little story that when I first saw this speech being given, afterwards I went on and I gave Trump these wonderful little snippets on his page. I copied and pasted it from YouTube of George Lopez saying "F that," pardon my French, puto. And I actually got restricted from that page for a little bit because I was spamming. And I thought I was doing a great job. And then I looked into the quote a little bit more once I had my walkaway moment. And I said, well, the man is kind of right. The man is kind of right with what's happening down at the border. And it was very, taken out of context.
Yep.
And while the establishment GOP has done a great job of saying, oh, well, don't be like Venezuela, don't be like Cuba. Hispanics are naturally or traditionally conservative. They haven't done much else with it.
Yeah.
So I think that the president has actually done a great job in outreach, something that I do think, in all seriousness, the Democrats have done historically better.
But you said it right. I mean, it's one of those things. They always take these quotes out of context, and obviously it wasn't maybe the most eloquent thing, but that's kind of like what we like about him, is that he's not this eloquent, polished guy. He speaks from the heart. He shoots from the hip. So what he's talking about the border crisis, and the border is a mess. I mean, you got drugs, you got the coyotes, you got human trafficking, you got all sorts of things on the border, and some of these border towns in Mexico are some of the most violent areas, not only in the country but in the world. And he was speaking to that, and if you look now at the most recent data from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, which is some of the most Hispanic counties in the country, Zapata County, he crushed it. He crushed it, and he was able to maintain a strong win in Texas by flipping those counties. So it just goes to show that the one, because we're talking about the communities that are probably the most offended by those comments going back to 2015, but they're the communities that seem to have flipped the most for him. So all this stuff that we've been told by GOP consultants and all these types of hacks is all counterintuitive, because at the end of the day, he's actually gained in support. He's doing more. And the GOP, they have these lame talking points about socialism and this and that. It's okay. It's fine. Whatever. We all hate socialism too, but it's kind of like repetitive and dried out. And then you get this guy who kind of just, he is machismo. He is just kind of like this guy who just shoots from the hip. And I think people respect that. Would you not agree?
I'd say to a certain degree, yes. And when it comes to the machismo, a household in a culture in Hispanic families, I'd say a 50-50. It's something like where they say that while men may nod or shake their head, it's the woman who's the neck that turns it for them. So it kind of works in tandem that way. Now, when it comes to the president, and you look at what's happening actually at the southern border, there's a lot of reasoning behind that. And you see that up to 80% of women who cross the border have a chance of getting raped. That little girls, teenagers, have to take contraceptives before they cross the border. That is not something that should be happening whatsoever. And when you look at people like Joe Biden, where he's saying, I don't even know what coyotes are, and the Democrats coming out with their rhetoric of ignorance, where they really don't know what's happening at the border. Joe Biden literally was under Obama, who was, nicknamed the deporter in chief for 8 years. He was a senator for decades before that. How did he not know that coyotes are a real problem at the border, where there are people women being taken and sold into sex slavery?
Yep.
It's so astounding. And then you have people still pushing, especially, self-hating suburban, white women that are saying that, oh, well, the poor little brown people, we need to help them in the whole issue of white man's burden. It's just simply pandering. It doesn't make you a better person. Yeah, it doesn't make you a better person.
And they virtue signal for their own sins. So you talked about the awfuls, these affluent white female liberals who basically, I'm sure, they have house sitters and they have staff that are Hispanic, and they probably treat them like trash because they're upper middle class and they're just obnoxious. So in their personal lives, they're probably really nasty people. They probably don't even tip well. But in their politics, all of a sudden, they're like, oh, I'm the white knight. I'm this white savior. I'm going to save all these poor brown people. And it's like, shut up. Shut up. Like, first off, focus on your own life first. Like, be a better person with the people you interact with. And I worked in restaurants my whole life, and I remember seeing this firsthand. You get these people who come in who I know are big Democrats, who are probably liberals, and they probably pride themselves on how good of a Democrat they are. And then in person, they're the worst people. They're the nastiest people. They're not nice, but they make up for their own sins through their crappy politics, which basically just describes the suburban white woman, the wine moms to a T.
Oh, yeah, playing bridge on weekends or whatever.
I don't know if they play bridge, but okay. I think you're describing like an old person's home, but I get what you're saying.
Thank you. This is why you have me on, because you can finish my thoughts.
Yes.
And really, it's not only that, but you touched on the southern border crisis. I'd like to highlight Judicial Watch did a pretty in tune study with what was happening down there. And if you look along the southern border states, that is about 50% of all crime that's happening. Federal crime is happening that's down there. If you look even closer, 40% of that 50 was actually border towns or districts with border cities in them. So you see all of this happening, and then you have the liberals saying no, open borders. And mind you, a lot of the time when these giant caravans are coming up, it's not just poor people looking for jobs and on asylum. It's just regular people that want money to send back to their homes. So, and people really went into the caravan and started asking these questions.
Right.
So now you have people that are advocating for the creation of a literal second class of illegal immigrants that happen to be Hispanic, because they're not being pushed to get their paperwork, so they can obviously get paid less.
Yep,
So,
and they'd be taking advantage of.
exactly.
They have
So
no recourse.
right, they're being taken advantage of, and there's no, like, sort of workers' rights compensation. And
Yep.
then because of the lack of push for citizenship, and here on in Queens and Roosevelt Avenue, there's a huge enterprise for it. You can go and buy Social Security cards, green cards, visas, whatever you need for about $120. You can
Yep.
go and do it, and people won't bat an eye. But you're still encouraging, not you, Gavin, but these liberals that we're talking
Thank
about
you. Yes,
are
yes.
encouraging. You're very welcome. The the doings of federal crimes, and nobody's really talking about this. But you still want to focus on a quote about what the president said that you just happen to not like the way he worded it. How about we look at the fact that for 25 consecutive months, that Hispanic unemployment was below 3.5%.
Yeah. You bring up a good point, though, that no one really talks about, is that the reason they want this mass illegal immigration is it's cheap labor that they can abuse. It's labor that has no recourse in the courts of law. It's labor that really can't come after you if they're abused or they're taken advantage of. And it's labor that they can pay close to nothing. And I remember, going back, the old leftist populists of old, including what's his name, Chavez, not the American one. I forget the name of the movement.
Hugo Chavez.
No, not Hugo Chavez. The guy in the U.S. In the Southwest.
Cesar Chavez.
Yes, Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was this old school leftist, but he was kind of a populist. And his whole shtick was, okay, but these illegal immigrants coming in are labor competition to legal Hispanics and Hispanics who have already been here. And they're also just people who are going to be taken advantage of by these corporations, et cetera. So he approached it almost from a labor perspective, standing up for labor. Right. And the Democrats have abandoned that. The Democrats have just admitted that they're the party of globalist corporations, and all they want is just cheap labor so they could, use as their own servants. The only diversity they want is that they want their waiter not to look like them. They want the people that do their dirty work not to look like them. It's kind of like this sick, twisted thing if you think about it. It's like this bourgeoisie. It's this really like we talked about, those suburban affluent people who are just obsessed with this, and in their personal lives they never really respect the values that they preach politically.
There was a really interesting Freudian slip, and I forget which actress or Hollywood's B-lister it was, but she was on The View, and she said on the if Trump were to win and he wanted to throw out all these illegal immigrants, who would wash his toilets? That little snippet right there is the general idea of what these people really think about the Hispanic voting base. Who's going to wash or clean up after us? And
smug. They're neo-aristocrats. They're basically aristocrats. Like they're like modern aristocrats, like the nobility. And their whole political view is, how do I enrich myself at the expense of others? And then they hide it. They hide it under like this feel-good message. But it's also like, why don't you get to the root of why is there mass migration from, say, some of these Central American countries? Because do you think it's good for a country to lose like all these people? Like, because a country that has massive immigration, even historically, like if we look back the last 100 years, like, my family's from Italy. Italy used to be a massive place where people would flee from. Why? Because they had structural problems. It was impoverished. They had a whole peasant class. They had the mafia. They had crime. There was a reason people left. Why don't you go and try to see how those countries can make it so that people want to stay in their own countries, so they don't have a brain drain, so they build their own economies? Because how can a country sustain itself if all its people are leaving, young, old, educated, uneducated? It's not a sustainable system.
Right. It's like a factory.
Yeah.
You're pumping out people from the country of origin, and you're just shipping them out Amazon Express, to the United States. And I would speak to people, and they say, how dare you, you're not a real Hispanic. And, after all of that was said and done, I would say, do you realize that when you just have people having this mass exodus from South American and Latin American countries, you realize that it's kind of like when you don't clean your room and you just stuff everything in the closet. Eventually that pile is going to get so big that you can't hide it anymore, and it's just going to be trash everywhere.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that sort of trash happening now. We're seeing that in the government. We're seeing that in their economic structures.
Yep.
And it's all because people refuse to fight back. And people say, well, if you're so smart, what do you recommend? What would you do? And I said, well, you're not going to like it. But you can either A, have the United States come in and intervene and, have some sort of proxy war against these, guerrilla factions that we're fighting. Or B, you guys can start your own revolution. Fight back against these people. And I said, I know it's a very difficult thing, and I'm not saying that it's an easy task, but nothing is easy, especially if you want your freedom. After you gave it away, there's no way that a person's going to give up their power. So they said, well, that's impossible. I said, you're in the United States. You realize that there were 13 ragtag, colonies that said, guess what? We don't like this anymore. And they found ways of doing it. If people can find ways to smuggle drugs and people throughout the world from this country of origin, wherever it may be, you should be able to find a way to do that for arms, take up arms, and fight back.
You make a good point, because basically what this mass migration out is doing, with the analogy you made with like putting the stuff in the closet, is if you're able to just leave, there's no incentive for you to stay and fix it. So if you have a corrupt government, I remember I had a friend, he was Salvadoran, he basically told me like the president of El Salvador makes like 5x what the US president does, and the country is smaller than Long Island. It's like all these inequities and all this corruption in these countries will never be fixed if people are just going to be able to incentivize them to leave. But if they are forced to stay, that's when you'll start to see real change and reform, because you can't just flee from it anymore. You have to actually fight back. So it's kind of like, in this way, it's almost like offshoring the problem, because they're able to just get rid of people who may become dissidents. They're able to get rid of people who may fight back, and they get rid of their criminals and things like that. And a lot of them are criminals. And those criminals that come over here, who do they terrorize the most? I mean, if you want to talk about MS-13 and all these groups, they terrorize their ethnic compatriots. They're going to terrorize other members of, say, the Salvadoran community in this instance, and whatever other gang it may be, in their own communities. So when these liberals are like, oh, they're not a big deal, they're not a big deal. Yeah, because they're not bothering you. They're not in your cul-de-sac, but they are bothering people in communities in Long Island, in Queens, wherever it is, and they're killing them. Actually, I remember I worked in restaurants. One of the guys I used to work with, he was a busboy with me, and he killed himself because MS-13 was after him. He jumped onto the train tracks in Long Island. He jumped onto the LIRR track. That guy never would have been killed if there wasn't the crime.
That was your friend.
It was my friend. He worked. He worked his whole life. Gilberto. He worked his whole life.
Yeah.
And he busted his ass in the diner we worked with together. Did a good job. Everything was fine. He didn't bother anyone, but they were after him for some money or whatever the hell it was, and he had to kill himself. That never would have happened if we didn't allow the importation of these criminal gangs. And it was the same thing 100 years ago with the mafia. The mafia followed. The mafia hurt their own communities the most, which were Italians, and you had to come down on them and you had to destroy the mafia. Now the mafia is pretty much gone. I mean, it's like in certain circles, but it's not what it used to be. So this is a thing that repeats, but the blasé attitude to it from the left and from liberals only makes things worse.
No, I mean 100%. And these are the same people that are asking to take away the police from these communities. So I think that, and this is a point that I get to, they're pushing for, here in New York State, the state leadership is pushing for the legalization of prostitution and sex work here in the United States, here in New York specifically first. And I tell them, I said, do you realize the issues that are happening with women? If you're for women, do you realize the issues that are happening here, that they're being sex trafficked into this part of Queens, into this part of the state? What are you going to do to help them before you start saying, well, I guess free love? So they said, well, yeah, good point. You should run for office. And I said, that's funny, because if you knew more about me, you would not want me to. But I'm glad to see that some people still have their heads, still attached to their neck. I'm sorry. It gets me so pissed off thinking about how much virtue signaling and nothing's really coming from it. People want to cry about how bad they feel, and nothing ever comes from it. I mean, I think that President Trump is the only person to make Democrats actually defend a violent terrorist organization. I don't even want to call it a gang. What they do is terrorist.
Terror, yeah, it is. They're so violent.
Yeah, they decapitated people's heads and they held them off of like a bridge.
Yep.
Like that's not stuff. That's something you would see out of like a comic book out of
ISIS.
Days of old.
It's ISIS.
Yeah, ISIS stuff. But it's real. And Nancy Pelosi said, no, we love them. We love immigrants. They're like, no, pendejo, we're not talking about immigrants. Where they
pile them together like they're the same people. And it's like, look, take a hardworking legal immigrant, don't put them in the same category as some criminal thug. Like, it's like they try to just like generalize everything and mush them together when they're really separate issues, and you need to tackle them and you need to be real about them. And all this fluffy feel good nonsense only hurts people you're supposed to help. And the thing about Trump is that he says the things you're not supposed to say, but the things that need to be said. Because if it was easy, it can't be easy. You have to. These are the hard things that need to be said. Those are the way you fix problems. You can't just get the easy way out and just say all this fluffy, feel-good nonsense. You have to address the issues head on, which is what he does, and he took flack for it. But you're also talking about this human trafficking issue. No one wants to talk about human trafficking. It's a massive problem, particularly sex trafficking, particularly trafficking among children. Now we know all the stuff that happened with Epstein and this whole pedophile rings and all this stuff. This happens in mass. I mean, this happens in mass. And when he had we're going to get into a different topic here, but these open borders and all this stuff with the criminal gangs, it's drugs and it's people. Right. And it's some of the it's basically modern day human slavery. It's human chattel slavery, and they don't give a crap about it. Nope. But that's something that Trump and his administration has been coming down so hard on to fight. And it's actually been a huge positive note in his administration that he's pushed back against the human traffickers.
Right. No, in talks of immigration reform, he has signed in, executive orders to actually help aid women and people who have been sex trafficked, who have been, especially across the border. And of course, the media doesn't cover that, but they'll try and spin a narrative of saying that ICE apparently lost 150 plus kids at the border. And like, you realize that when people don't come documented, you can't just hold them. You also can't hold a child in a prison because you just simply can't. It doesn't make any sense. And Trump actually in 2018 signed an executive order to keep families together. So that cuts the amount of waiting time down because you can't really hold the children by themselves anyways. So if people come without any sort of documentation, we don't know who they are, and we can't trust who they say they are. And then when they're released, they're supposed to report back. If you remember the debates, Gavin, Trump said only the stupid ones come back, because they know if they come back, they're going to be deported.
Right.
So that's why they just disappear. So they're looking for Juan, Juanita, Ernesto, and, they can't find these little kids. Well, it's because they didn't sign back in. So they're not, and you can't chase them because now they're literally somewhere in the United States and there's no way of telling where they are. And you can't either provide care that was necessary, or you can't ensure that there's a safe,
there's no paper trail
back home. Right. There's no paper trail whatsoever.
Yeah. It's like they don't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you don't exist on paper, you're easy to take advantage of. You could be the victim of a crime. You could be taken. You could be kidnapped. I mean, you're a nobody. You're the person from nowhere with no identity because legally you don't exist. And going back to the whole the Epstein stuff, they used to we watched all the documentaries that came out on Netflix and all that. Mm-hmm. They used to kidnap American kids, but they got in trouble when Epstein first got caught. It was because he was kidnapping, American citizens who could be tracked and had families. So what did they start to do? They moved to the island. They started bringing in kids from, Latin America, and they started kidnapping illegals who couldn't be found and couldn't be tracked. And there's no one to ask any questions when they disappear. So it's all this insidious like nastiness that people just want to brush under the rug, right, because they all just want to talk about, open borders, kumbaya, but it's BS. It's BS. And if you go to Latin American countries, they don't have open borders. Imagine if 500,000 gringos wanted to go to some country in Latin America, they would never allow it. They would never allow it. Why? What? They would never allow it. One, because it comes down to economics. If you have mass migration, the cost of labor drops, and then everyone gets paid less. And when you get paid less, everyone's poor. So it's like you have to find a balance. And when you have just unmitigated mass migration, especially when it's like, with all the other issues we talked about, it's a recipe for disaster. And that's what we're seeing. And it's just hypocrisy and it's just stupidity. And, I know what's going to happen too. I can make a prediction right now. The second the numbers for Hispanics, if they keep creeping up, like they creeped up this cycle for Republicans, if they get past 40, maybe they were past 40, we don't know the real numbers, but if they keep getting higher, all of a sudden, watch, Dems are going to want to shut down the border. The second they see that those numbers for Hispanics are trending Republican, then they're going to want to shut down the border. That's what it all is, because it all comes down to power, politics, and money. It's not about people. It's not about helping people. That's all BS. And if you believe that, you're stupid. I'm sorry. If you believe it's really about caring for people, you're just dumb and you're a lemming, like you were talking about.
Well, that's a very interesting prediction, and
Because they don't
that
want Cubans. They don't want Cubans
they
coming in.
don't. I think
They've
Cuban
done
identity.
everything to stop Cubans, but the second it's
Right.
the broader Hispanic community and not just the Cubans, I think Colombians are up there in terms of being right wing and Nicaraguans and a few others. But the second they see that Hispanics as a whole, which also, by the way, I mean, we could talk about it. It's also just like it's such a broad term. Like
Right.
it's such a broad term. Like I mean, we could talk about this now with like the Latinx thing. Like it's
Yeah.
so stupid. It's so stupid. Like
Right.
because you're trying to say like a guy from Argentina is not the same person as a Mayan from the Yucatan, and the Mayan from the Yucatan is not the same person as a Cuban, and the Cuban is not the same person as an Ecuadorian. They're very different. They speak Spanish. They speak forms of Spanish. Some of the Spanish could be very different. Argentinian Spanish is like Italian almost, and then Mexican Spanish is different, and then Cuban Spanish is different. So they just try to lump them in as like this one big monolith when it's not really a monolith, right?
Yeah, no, not whatsoever. And you could definitely tell a person, by where they come from, their country of origin, when they actually start to speak the language itself.
Yep.
And we don't always necessarily get along just because we speak the same language. There are prejudices back in the motherlands to people from other people's country of origin. So to act as if it's always just been this kumbaya, it's kind of like with the Native Americans, like, oh well, they were all so happy before the white man came. It's like, no, it simply wasn't true. No matter what point in history you look at, and it's not to say that not everyone can coexist or whatnot. I mean, I think New York City is a beautiful example of that, especially Queens.
Yeah,
but
where we're both from,
right? Where we're from. But at the same time, when you're trying to force this down people's throats, it's just going to wind up like it's just going to look like Europe. If you see what's happening over there, it's sad. It's a shame.
Europe's turning into a giant Yugoslavia because, well, I mean, there's also the religious aspect. The one thing that makes our immigration different is Hispanics are still Christian. So at the end of the day, you're either going to a Catholic church or you're going to a Hispanic evangelical church. So it reduces one layer from like assimilation. But you go to Europe, it's the opposite. It's mass Islamic migration.
Well, I'd say the biggest threat isn't necessarily that people are being coerced into Islam here in the United States. Hispanic, the new generations that are being born here, I'd say they're getting wrapped up into the postmodernist nihilism of that liberals teach. Like, your life has no purpose. You can just die tomorrow. It won't change a thing. You're just a blue dot in an infinite universe. So just YOLO and just not care about anything else but yourself.
Most times it's the children that were born here are worse than their parents or grandparents because one, they don't work as much as their parents did because their parents came and they made the money and they opened the businesses and now they've made successful. Two, those kids are now going through our crappy education system, which is just indoctrination. So you're right. The ones that are the most woke and the most left is not the guy who just got here. It's his kid or grandkid, which are the ones that are now wearing, they have purple hair and they don't even speak Spanish sometimes. And they're just like, and they're even the ones that don't speak Spanish, I feel like, are the ones that are even more, they have like a chip on their shoulder and like they cling on to it even more because they need to use it like politically so they can be like lecture other people. Am I right or am I wrong? I mean, that's my experience.
Oh, no, 100%. You certainly do get a little bit ousted in family gatherings if you're not speaking Spanish. Certain cultural expectations that are there, but at the same time you start to look down at these people. I've seen liberals as their kids look down on their parents that brought them here, their grandparents. And I'd say you realize that they came here for you. I might not agree with the method, but I still think that you should make up for whatever shortcomings they may have. Do something with your life because you are here and there's nothing that's going to be here to hold you back. I had my professor recently talk about how privileged she was because she's white and whatnot. And what's interesting was that she comes from France and the person talking about racial diversity in the workplace came from Jamaica. And I said, what's interesting? Both of you have a pretty nice opinion of what's happening, but yet you were not here during the time of the civil rights. Your families weren't around during the time of Jim Crow and slavery. So really, there's nothing for you to be apologizing for on one hand or saying that we should do anything better because this country at this current time when you emigrated here gave you the opportunity to succeed. And I'd say unless either of you are actually going to give me that position that you have, then there's no point in apologizing.
And just shut up. Then just shut up.
Exactly. It's the racism of low expectations. I know that's the title of Barbara from Harlem's book, but that's really what it is. Nothing can stop me. And I should, as a human and as an adult, be able to figure out a way to come out ahead in this country. There's always one way. And I know that, people are, clown the military all the time, But if you really want to get a college education or a technical education, the
Join the
military is
army.
the way to go.
Yeah.
Why
And
not?
you said it right. I mean, like the way they talk about this whole concept of privilege is one of the things that really killed the Democrat Party and will kill the Democrat Party, because privilege is not based on just racial lines. There's a socioeconomic aspect to it. And the reason the Democrats lost the blue wall in 2016, they lost a lot of ground, is because all these poor, disenfranchised whites who exist in mass were told, like, they went to Appalachia and they went to these poor Rust Belt towns. They went to all these, cities in the South, and all these people that are poor whites. And they said, oh, no, you're privileged because you're white. It's like, really? My mom died of heroin. I don't have an education. I don't have a job. I'm on welfare. I'm on food stamps. Oh, no, but you're white, so you're privileged. Shut up and accept it. And this is usually coming from another white person who actually is privileged. Again, it's them self-projecting. It's upper middle class whites telling other whites that they're privileged, and they're doing it under this racial connotation when it really has nothing to do with race. Because if you look at class in the country, a working class black guy has a lot more in common with a working class white guy, who has a lot more in common with a working class Hispanic guy, than any of them do with their upper class racial compatriots. Yeah. So, and I remember I was talking to someone about this the other day. There was an SNL skit, I think it was called Black Jeopardy, and the whole shtick about it had Tom Hanks. The whole shtick was that the white redneck understood and got all the Black Jeopardy questions right, because they had a lot more in common than they thought, because they both come from lower economic social stratas. So that's all it is. And people are trying to stop that and make it about race, because the Democrat Party needs to keep people like really divided, because the Democrat Party is a house of cards. They need to maintain these massive majorities with these racial groups, or they lose. That's why when you talk about Republicans and Trump, he doesn't have to win the black vote. He just needs to chip away a few points, and then they collapse. That's why they're so worried. But at the same time, he also has to keep his white base as well. So it's a balancing act. But you chip away at the edges, the Democrat machine kind of falls apart, unless, of course, they do have the rigging and the fraud and all that.
Yeah, and the things that we've seen. But I think it's so great to see that under this administration, for the first time, the average Hispanic household median income has reached $50,000. And that's not because of bailouts. That's just because we're working more, we're working and we're getting compensated for it, and we're actually buying homes. Dollars bring dignity, as Ice Cube said. So, with that, and now we're seeing that people are actually wanting to participate more than actually rely on the welfare system, as Rashida Tlaib said, I think in one of the last State of the Union addresses, that Trump, stole so much welfare from the minority communities. I said, no. We just found reason to actually work instead of having to survive off of
your handouts.
Exactly. And the handouts is what really allows them to have been in control for so long and to keep.
They want them dependent. They want a corrupt political machine where everyone that votes for you is dependent on you. That's not freedom. That's not America. You want people to be self-sufficient. You want people to be able to make up their own minds, have their own businesses, have their own incomes, because then they can be free people. You never have a free society if everyone's taking a check from the government. It's simply not going to happen. And look, I'm a kind of guy who, I support some of these stimulus checks during the COVID thing, because we shut down the businesses and people are going through a hard time. I understand. I'm not one of those Republicans who's just obstinate and won't accept, some changes here and there. But what the left wants to do, the radical left, they don't want you to work, period. They just want you all just to be basically serfs. They want you to be serfs. If you are working, they want you to work for like Amazon or something, and they want you just to make enough money just to like be able to survive and vote for them. That's all they want. They don't want you to succeed. They don't want you to grow. They don't want you to have large families. They don't want you to do anything that previous generations of Americans took for granted. They want you basically just wealthy and just have enough resources to survive, but not too much to start thinking for yourself and to start being a problem for them, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that moving forward, what the GOP needs to do to win is not just rely on Trump's outreach abilities, but to also take what they've learned and work with outside organizations that have bilingual speakers and work on local races. You do that, you'll have someone that felt like they never had people, knock on their door before, and actually feel like you have people that will actually feel like they're contributing to the future of their country.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to happen. I mean, and this is what I'll say. We worked, the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, the New York chapter here actually worked with Jamie Silvestri. It was like one of the first times that they actually had any bilingual speakers out there. And for a time before the mail-in dumps came in,
Yep.
she
won
by 154, and that was equivalent to one weekend of us door knocking.
Yep. I mean, look, I think she won. And if you look at New York State, I think a lot of these people won. I mean, the day of the election, it was like 44%. And we just stopped counting ballots like this week or last week or something insane. There was a rig here in New York as well, because all these races had won. There was a red wave in New York. And then they took all the mail-ins and they neutered it. It was all a sham. And they took their time because they needed to know how many votes they needed. And they've stolen races left and right in the Assembly and the Senate and in the Congress. And it's just disgusting what's going on, but you guys have been doing great, and I know we're pushing up on the hour mark. We have another show to head to, but I want to pass it off for the last words to you and to let the audience know where they can follow you.
Thank you so much. So closing remarks would be this: don't let anyone tell you that you can't achieve anything on the basis of the color of your skin or your gender. Always make sure to fight back and stand up, because the best way to actually show that you're better than what they think of you, to escape that racism and low expectations, is by actually succeeding. And with that being said, if you'd like to continue the movement, the Hispanic conservative movement, please check out the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. Select your state. If you're in New York, please check out the New York chapter. And if you want to hear more about my stuff and follow me a little bit, you can find me on social media at Baron_Montalvo on Twitter, at Baron.Montalvo. That's Baron. I'm not trying to copy the president's name. It's a title of nobility as such, on Instagram. And if you type in the pages on the pages section of Facebook, it is Gabriel E. Montalvo. You can follow me there and send me a DM. I'd love to talk more. And also follow the Empire State Conservatives podcast. We'll have a great episode tonight.
Thank you, Gabe. All right, guys, tune in. We'll maybe have an upload episode today or tomorrow. I don't know. We're just rolling with it. All right, take care, guys.